Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. We are continuing in our studies from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. Our lesson focuses today on chapter 12. But in order to fully understand chapter 12, we really need to realize or maybe have a short review of some of chapter 11. And I hope it's a short review so that we can get everything in. When I study for the Sunday school lesson to present it in the format we're doing this morning, I pray for two things. One, that I will understand what God's message says, just understanding the scripture itself. Sometimes, especially with Old Testament passages, it can be a bit difficult to know exactly what the message says. Then the second prayer is that I will deliver the message that God intended, that it will not be my message, but it will be God's message. And so, first, that I understand, and second, that I know the meaning so that I can relay that as the Sunday school presentation. Therefore, I believe we must look at chapter 11 for a couple of things. One, in chapter 11, Jeremiah lets God know, or lets the people know, that God has told him that there is a plot against him. Chapter 11, verse 18 says, "Because the Lord revealed that plot to me, I knew it. For at that time he showed me what they were doing." God has told Jeremiah in chapter 11 that ultimately, and Jeremiah tells the people, God is going to judge his people, and destruction is going to come upon them. Let's look at verse 17 of chapter 11. "The Lord Almighty, who planted you, has decreed disaster for you." Jeremiah speaking to the people of Judah. "Because the house of Israel and the house of Judah have done evil and provoked me to anger by burning incense to Baal." And then we read verse 18 where Jeremiah says, "God has revealed a plot against me." Who is plotting against him in verse 11? In verse 19, "I had been like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter. I did not realize that they had plotted against me." And this is what they said. "Let us destroy the tree and its fruit. Let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name be remembered no more. But O Lord Almighty, you who judge righteously and test the heart and mind, let me see your vengeance upon them, for to you I have committed my cause." Then, following thereafter, verse 21, "Therefore this is what the Lord says about the men of Anathoth." That's Anathoth, Anathoth. "About the men of Anathoth who are seeking your life and saying, 'Do not prophesy in the name of the Lord, or you will die by our hands.'" Who are the men of Anathoth? Jeremiah is from Anathoth. His father was a priest there. And so these are family and friends, are close closely related to Jeremiah who are plotting against them. Verse 22, therefore this is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish them. Their young men will die by the sword, their sons and daughters by famine. Not even a remnant will be left to them. So that's our background, and we go immediately into chapter 12. We've seen the Lord's promise of vengeance on Jeremiah's conspirators. And by the way, the word Lord is spelled capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Anytime you see that in the New Old Testament in particular, and really in the Old Testament as well, we are referring to, or the passage is referring to Yahweh. The Jews so revered his name, and quite frankly were so afraid of even saying his name, Yahweh. They wrote it out, and it's translated Lord in all caps. So, the Lord has promised vengeance on Jeremiah's conspirators. That should have satisfied Jeremiah. But now we get to chapter 12, and Jeremiah responds with praise, but then he has some questions about the way things are going on in the world, especially during his time. And so, chapter 12, verse 1, you are always righteous, O Lord, when I bring a case before you. So Jeremiah has found that when he asks God questions, God has always been righteous and has been patient with him. So when Jeremiah asks questions to the Lord, or has even complained to him, he has found God to be righteous. So with that premise and that praise to God, God, you are righteous, Jeremiah would like some clarification or clarifications on the following matters. He says, the second half of verse 1, yet I would speak with you about your justice. Now that he's getting close, I believe, he's getting close to a difficult area. He's going to ask the why question. But here, he is questioning God's either judgment or his justice. He says, yet I would speak with you about your justice. And what is it that he wants to speak to him about? He says, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all of the faithless live at ease? Verse 2, you have planted them and they have taken root. They grow and bear fruit. You are always on their lips, but far from their hearts. The them in verse 2 are the wicked. Why are the wicked prospering? You've told me that you'll bring your judgment, your vengeance upon those who are plotting against me. But let me go further and ask, why are the wicked prospering? Why do they seem to be living at ease? Just dawned on me, I skipped a verse in chapter 11, verse 16. The Lord, here's Jeremiah talking to the Judean citizens. The Lord called you a thriving olive tree with fruit beautiful in form, but with the roar of a mighty storm, he will set it on fire, and its branches will be broken. So Israel is often referred to or compared to the olive tree. Jeremiah in verse 2 says, you have planted them and they have taken root. They grow and bear fruit. Again, who are the they? It's the wicked. You planted them. You put them in this land, and they've taken root, and they've borne fruit. Their fruit generally, one translation says they bear children. So the wicked are begatting. Is that begetting? Children. Others like them. He says, that's true. You are always on their lips. They speak well. They say, we are God's people. But you are far from their hearts. So he uses the tree analogy again. That's why I needed to go back and make that reference out of chapter 11. And he says, God, I have a question about it. It's not just, is it? Why do you allow the wicked to do well, to seem to be living at ease, seemingly receiving God's blessings? It's not theocracy, but theodicy. I came across that word, and it supposedly it is supposed to mean how can a good God allow bad things to happen? Or how does a good God allow bad people to prosper? Which also raises several questions. Is it okay for us to question God, to ask him why? I suspect most of us have at some point in time asked God, why? God, why did you allow this bad thing to happen? Now, Jeremiah is asking it just the opposite. Why do you allow bad people to have good things? But why do good people suffer bad results sometimes? In fact, Jeremiah is going to place himself in that position, that is, of a good person who is experiencing bad things. He says in verse 3, "Yet you know me, O Lord. You see me and test my thoughts about you." Now, he's just talked about the wicked who have been planted, who grow and bear fruit. That is, they receive the benefits of God's blessings, it seems. And you're on their lips. They say your name. They sometimes talk a good talk, but they're far from your heart. But you know me. You have examined me. You have tested my thoughts about you. You know that I am not prospering, that I am the subject of plots against me. And then he says, in essence, here's what I want you to do about it. You love me. You know me. You've called me. You told me, and we studied this in our first chapter of Jeremiah, that you knew me before I was formed in the womb, and I was going to be your prophet. Now, I have a request for you. That's the last half of verse 3. And so listen to this. Drag them off, that is, the wicked, drag them off like sheep to be butchered. Most translations say slaughtered. Set them apart for the day of slaughter. I have a request. Let your justice prevail now. Don't let the wicked prosper. Instead, lead them to slaughter. And of course, he's talking especially against those who are conspiring against him. But he's not asking just for himself. We'll see in the following verses. He's asking also for judgment upon these people for the sake of all of Judah, all of what's remaining of Israel. Quick sidestep. Remember, after Solomon's son Rehoboam really was oppressive. The northern 10 tribes of Israel broke away from the southern tribes and formed the northern kingdom called Israel. the southern kingdom remained, and that's Judah, the tribe of Judah, the largest, and one of the smaller ones, Benjamin. Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom, and they are still in the land. The northern kingdom has been destroyed already by the Assyrians as God's judgment upon them for worshiping idols and refusing to heed his warning, his counsel that they must turn back to him and do away with the detestable practices that went along with the worship of idols. So the northern kingdom is no longer in existence, having been destroyed and dispersed by the Assyrians. Now, in Jeremiah's time, about 100 years later, the southern kingdom is continuing much of the same practices as the northern kingdom. God has sent his prophets, Jeremiah being one of them, to warn against their rejection of God by the worship of idols. And there is a new power out there. It is the Babylonians. Jeremiah, that's the aside. Now let's get back to verse 4 of chapter 12. He's not asking just for his own sake, but for the sake of all the people. He says, "How long will the land lie parched, and the grass in every field be withered? Because those who live in it are wicked. The animals and birds have perished. Moreover, the people are saying, he will not see what happens to us." Jeremiah knows that righteousness raises a nation up, exalts a nation. But sin is a reproach to any people. As we studied chapter 7 in last week's lesson, I don't think we could escape the analogy of what Jeremiah was saying in repeating God's words to the people, that has an application to the United States of America, which I do believe has been chosen and blessed by God. And we have been, I hesitate to say a righteous nation, but we have been the shining light to the whole world. And we have grown in influence and power. And now, sin and evil doing and wickedness seems to be undermining our very nature, our very being, such that our standing in the world may be sinking or crumbling. So that's what's happening in Jeremiah's day. And as a result, the whole land of Judah was experiencing the effects of sin to its inhabitants. We are seeing sin and greed and grasp for power, probably related to greed, so that those who are in power exercise that power for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the whole. And Jeremiah says the whole land is seeing the effects. I think we are seeing the effects. Major cities across this country are crumbling from within because sin and the lack of accountability for that sin. Well, beginning in verse 5, God begins to respond to Jeremiah's question of why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? God begins to respond to him in verse 5. It's not exactly a rebuke to Jeremiah, but it is something like a reality check for him. And it's extremely interesting. Verse 5, if you have raced with men on foot, and they have worn you down, or they have worn you out, says the New International, how can you compete with horses? And then also, if you stumble in safe country, or if you put your trust in a land of safety, how will you manage in the thickets by the Jordan? Now, this is one of those areas where my prayer before getting started really comes into play. What is God actually saying? They're using some illustrations that are pertinent to the people of Judah, but unfamiliar to us. So God says to Jeremiah, picture yourself as a man in a race against other men. And the race itself has just worn you down, worn you out. Then if that's the case, how are you going to handle, or what are you going to do when you're supposed to race against horses, which are much more powerful, much faster? And then the other analogy, and if you're in a land of peace, are you trusting in a land of peace? Judah, Israel. What are you going to do when you have to deal with the thick undergrowth of the Jordan? Now, what is that talking about? The Jordan River would flood and overflow its banks and spread fertile soil along its valley, and vegetation would grow very thick and heavy, and animals, it became the natural habitat for animals, even wild animals. And so if you're just walking about in a safe area and you're complaining about the circumstances, what are you going to do when you have to walk in the midst of the wild animals in a jungle type setting? God is telling Jeremiah, the land is still relatively peace. And if you feel secure there, that you trust in that kind of peace, then what are you going to do when things get really hard in Judah? When I, God, am going to bring real and widespread destruction to the people. He is telling him, you think things are bad right now, but they're going to get much worse. So get ready. Gird up your loins, say some other passages that we've read. Persevere through hardship, which is a good lesson for all of us. We're not promised an easy walk, an easy path in life, although we live in a nation where we have been experiencing, in my lifetime, an easy path. But God says things can get really hard. And in verse 6, he says that your brothers, your own family. Now he's talking about verse 11, Anathoth. Even they have betrayed you. They have raised a loud cry against you. Do not trust them, though they speak well of you. Even your own family and friends from Anathoth have conspired against you. And if you hear them say good things about you to you, don't trust them, because they have conspired against you. And that was illustrated in chapter 7. Now, beyond telling him to be cautious of even the friends, supposed friends and family members, God is going to let Jeremiah in on what he plans to do with all of the people of Judah. Let's read verses 7, 8, and 9. I will forsake my house, abandon my inheritance. I will give the one I love into the hands of her enemies. My inheritance has become to me like a lion in the forest. She roars at me, therefore I hate her. We're going to have to talk about the word hate in just a moment. Has not my inheritance become to me like a speckled bird of prey that other birds of prey surround and attack? Go and gather all the wild beasts, bring them to devour. When he says, I will forsake my house, he's not, but there's a difference of opinion. Some say the temple, which, as we studied in last week's lesson, the people were saying, we're safe. We have God's temple here among us, and God's not going to let anything happen to us. Others say, no, he's talking about the house of Israel, or Judah, the whole country. I think he probably is talking about his temple, because he is. You plan on the temple being your salvation just because it's among you. I'm going to abandon it, and then you won't have any protection. I will abandon my inheritance. His inheritance is the promised land, his people. I will give the one I love into the hands of her enemies. Israel, the promised people, his people. They are the bride of God. And he says, I will give the one I love, my chosen people, into the hands of her enemies. Why? Because my inheritance, that is my people, has become to me like a lion in the forest. She roars at me. That's an analogy of a rebellious but dangerous people. Instead of showing love and respect for God, they roar at him like a lion, but off in the forest. Therefore, I will hate her. The word hate is not an angry despise. It is I cannot tolerate and will not tolerate that anymore. My inheritance has not my inheritance become to me like a speckled bird of prey. One translation said, or commentary, I guess it was, said a polka-dotted vulture, a speckled bird of prey. And all of the other birds will see that it's a problem. They will surround it and they will attack it. And that's what's going to happen to Israel, God is saying. So, as we said, Judah, the people of Judah are like a lion that roars against God in the forest. They're rebellious. They won't come to him. They stay in the forest and roar. They keep their distance from him. They're violent. They're deadly because of the acts and conduct they're engaged in. So God's going to keep his distance from them as well. And the speckled vulture, God is just speaking figuratively. Other nations are going to reject and they're going to attack. Everything God is describing here is that God is going to call Judah's neighbors to attack her as punishment for her conspiracies against God, and to some extent even Jeremiah. So the Lord continues to speak of the attack that Judah faces against from her neighbors in verses 10 through 12. Many shepherds will ruin my vineyard and trample down my field. They will turn my pleasant field into a desolate wasteland. It will be made a wasteland, parched and desolate before me. The whole land will be laid waste because there is no one who cares. The word shepherd, many shepherds will ruin my vineyard. Some translations say many pastors. We see the pastor as a shepherd in many biblical verses, but here more than likely it means leader. The leader, the shepherd is the leader of the flock. The pastor is the leader of the flock. These are the leaders. Some translations say the rulers, and they're going to come against Israel, and they're going to lay everything to waste. They're going to totally destroy and make my pleasant field a desolate wilderness. Jeremiah is telling the people that God is not going to allow them to continue to disregard him, to be wicked and prosper. He is going to bring about their destruction. He's going to use the surrounding nations to bring it about. And our last verse for study this morning is, they will sow wheat but reap thorns. They will wear themselves out but gain nothing. So bear the shame of your harvest because of the Lord's fierce anger. I left out verse 12. Over all the barren heights in the desert, destroyers will swarm. These Babylonians, really. For the sword of the Lord will devour from one end of the land to the other. It's going to be other nations that bring about the destruction, but it is God who is behind it all. God tells the people through Jeremiah, as he has been telling them, if you do not change from your wicked ways, if you continue to seek power by wickedness and greed and worship idols, then I'm going to bring destruction upon you, and it will be done by the nations around you. How does that apply to us today? If we continue to allow wickedness to go without accountability, if greed and power enables one to be more greedy and more powerful without being held accountable, God will raise up other nations around us. You can't watch much news these days without seeing the growing threat of China, and maybe in league with Russia and some other lesser countries who wish to take down this great nation that God has blessed. But just as God blessed Israel and Judah, he will not allow wickedness and rejection of him to remain without being judged. We need to turn our thoughts and our prayers to God and follow what he has laid out in his passages, his scripture, his verses, as his way, and follow his way. Otherwise, there's no reason why we could expect to escape the same fate that Israel and Judah experienced. Sort of a dark lesson, but a promise. There is a promise in the rest of chapter 12. It's not included in our passages for study this morning. I really don't know why, except maybe the time, where God says ultimately, after that destruction, after that judgment brought upon them, I will restore my people to the land. A promise of hope. Let's don't wait on that. Let's turn to God now. Thank you for joining us in this study and in this lesson today. Let me wish you a good day.